All right, so in this video, we're going to continue our discussion of potential connections between religion and morality by looking at the lawmaker argument discussed in our textbook and the divine command theory that's motivated by that argument. So we'll briefly review this idea of traditional theism. We'll then briefly review some of the potential connections between religion and ethics. Then we'll introduce the lawmaker argument. And then we'll talk about how that leads to the divine command theory. And why that theory might be attractive to a theist is what we'll talk about at the end. So traditional theism is the belief in the existence of exactly one God that's responsible for creating the universe and everything in it, including human beings. And this God is, according to this view, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good or morally perfect. Now, there's numerous religions in our world that are just as important and just as influential, but this sort of traditional theism you can see is espoused by at least many forms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and those religions have had a very sort of huge impact on sort of Western society and especially within U.S. culture. And so it's interesting to sort of think about this particular kind of religion and how many people try to connect it up with ethical ideas. All right, so as I mentioned, there are different ways you could try to connect religious ideas with ethical ideas. We briefly mentioned 3 in the last video. But as I said, our focus is going to be on the following potential connection, where people try to use these religious ideas to provide a source or foundation of morality. And the idea is, look, if morality is sort of out there, well, where did it come from? So what explains how morality got there? Well, it's sometimes thought that God can play an important ethical role by sort of serving as an explanation for where morality comes from. God might thereby serve a role as the creator of morality. All right, so many people tend to think that without a God, sort of morality, as we sort of discuss it, would sort of be a sham. And the idea is nicely summarized by a quote that's often attributed to Dostoevsky. But this is not actually an exact quote. It's more like a very loose sort of explanation of the idea. But it's often sort of said as follows. If God is dead, then everything is permitted. That is, if there is no God, then there is no morality and you can just do whatever the hell you want. It's sort of anything goes. This, however, is only an intuition. There's no argument being presented here. And so you might ask, well, how could you develop the underlying idea into a more rigorous argument? So this brings us to the lawmaker argument. This argument claims that all laws require a lawmaker. So why should I believe that? Well, I might appeal to a kind of analogy. Consider the kinds of laws we have in our society. Laws about speed limits, laws about paying your taxes. These laws are rules that are put down in our society that persons can either choose to follow or choose not to follow. Well, where do those laws come from? They're not just there automatically. There has to be someone to create those laws. And at least in the United States, it is sort of Congress that creates the law. It's the legislative branch. It's a number of people that get together and they go through a huge sort of process where a law gets passed and signed, and then it goes into effect, and then it applies to everybody within this country because it was created by the lawmakers. So the idea is, when we look at that example of laws, it looks like those laws, in order to be there, needed to be created. So that is, if every law requires a lawmaker, that would mean that the moral law requires a lawmaker. These two are rules that seem to be laid down, that it's within our power to follow the rules, but it's also within our power to break the rules. Well, where do those laws come from? They need a lawmaker, just like the legal laws of our society do. Well, it is the lawmaker of morality must have perfect authority in order to be able to legitimately apply that law to everyone. And so the idea behind this is that if the lawmaker didn't have perfect authority, if the lawmaker, say, was us, human beings are fallible. And we're biased, we're prejudiced, and if we were to create these sort of rules, it'd likely be that our imperfection sort of infects the rules themselves. And so it's not clear why a rule that I make should have any authority over anyone else. And so the idea is, in order for morality to be objective and to sort of apply to everyone equally, it seems like whoever makes it would have to have some kind of perfect authority. Otherwise, those laws would seem to be sort of arbitrary. Now, God is the only being that would seem to have perfect authority, since God is, yet again, remember, supposed to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. Therefore, morality requires that God be the moral lawmaker. No, not the legal lawmaker, but the lawmaker for morality, these rules that are going to apply to everyone equally, and in order to make this non-arbitrary. Because yet again, if I was the lawmaker, well, people have different rules that they prefer, and it would be arbitrary to prefer my rules over your rules. But if God is perfect, well, then it looks like the rules are not arbitrary. All right, so now notice that there's three reactions someone might have to this argument. There's the optimistic theist. So if someone believes in God, they may look at this argument and they might conclude that God is the source of morality then. So they are optimistic in the sense that they believe that morality requires God, just like this argument says, but thankfully, God exists and created morality. And so we have these moral rules that apply to all of us equally. Then there's the pessimistic atheist. So if someone believes that God doesn't exist, then they might look at this argument and conclude that morality doesn't exist either. So they're pessimistic in the sense that they agree with this lawmaker argument. They agree that morality would require God. But unfortunately, they believe that God doesn't exist, and so there is no God to create morality. And so there are no moral laws that apply to sort of all of us equally in that way. And then there's the challenger. The challenger is someone who just rejects the argument altogether and denies that you need God to create morality. Now notice that both a theist and an atheist could take this option. So a theist might say, yes, I believe that there is a God, and I believe that there's morality, but God, you didn't need God to create morality. Then there's the atheist who says God doesn't exist, but morality still exists because, well, you didn't need God to create morality. All right. Now, if someone looks at that lawmaker argument and they think, oh yeah, that looks like a good argument, and they accept this conclusion that morality thereby requires God to create it, then they might be tempted by an ethical theory similar to the following that we'll call divine command theory. So on this view, the way that God creates morality is by issuing commands to human beings. And morality consists in obeying those commands, and immorality consists in our disobeying God's commands. So on this view, an act is morally required just because it's commanded by God, and it's immoral just because it's forbidden by God. So we think that rape and torture are immoral. Well, why are they immoral? Where does that immorality come from? Well, according to the divine command theory, it's because God has forbidden sort of rape and torture, and thus by engaging in those actions, we are disobeying the rules that have been set down by God, and disobeying those rules is just what immorality consists in. So on this view, God is the creator of morality. God is the lawmaker. God creates a moral law that applies to all of us in virtue of God's giving those commands. Without those commands, nothing would be right or wrong. So notice that the divine command theory seems to mesh well with some common ideas that show up in traditional versions of theism. And so this explains why there might be a number of advantages for the divine command theory if one already believes traditional theism. And that's a big if. But that is, if you already believe traditional versions of theism, notice traditional versions of theism say that God is the creator of everything that exists. And they say that God is all-powerful. And they say that God is sort of sovereign over everything. So notice, God is the creator of everything. That is, well, isn't morality a thing? And so if God is the creator of everything, wouldn't God have to be the creator of morality? And if you think that God is all-powerful, well, then the idea is, doesn't God have to have the power over morality? God can't be limited. So shouldn't God be in control of morality? If God isn't in control of morality, then isn't that to limit God's power? And so if you already accept that there is an all-powerful being, then it looks like a natural thing for you to say is that God has power over morality in that way. Moreover, God is sort of sovereign. That is, there's nothing outside of God. There's nothing sort of limiting God. God has authority over everything. And the idea is, if you have that belief, then wouldn't you have to conclude, if you are a sort of traditional sort of theist, wouldn't it make sense to say that God is sort of sovereign over morality as well? So given these ideas and the lawmaker argument, the divine command theory might seem like an especially attractive option for a theist to adopt. Now, interestingly, at least when you look throughout history, a number of theistic philosophers who have reflected on the divine command theory have actually rejected it, despite these attractions. So I'm not saying that the atheist rejects divine command theory. I'm saying many theists, so many of those people who believe in God, have actually rejected the divine command theory. Why would that be? Well, that's it for this video. In the next video, we will discuss why the divine command theory is often thought to be very unattractive, even for those people who already believe in God. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.